Spain, a land of sun-baked plains and mountain fortresses, a place where church bells and the call to prayer once echoed across the same valleys. Have you ever wondered what it took to become a legend in such a world? Can one man truly change the course of history through sword and will alone? In the 11th century, a warrior rose from the dusty roads of Castile to become something extraordinary. His name was Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar, but history remembers him by another name, El Cid, the Lord. This is his story. Let us begin not with the man himself, but with the world that shaped him. To understand El Cid, we must first understand the land of his birth. We must walk the roads of medieval Iberia and breathe the air of a peninsula divided. Picture, if you will, the Iberian Peninsula in the early 11th century. This was not the unified Spain we know today. No single crown ruled from the Pyrenees to the southern shores. Instead, this sun-drenched land existed as a patchwork of kingdoms, each with its own ambitions, its own fears, its own dreams of glory. In the north, the Christian kingdoms clung to their mountain strongholds: Castile, Leon, Navarre, Aragon, and the counties of Catalonia. These realms had grown slowly over centuries, pushing southward in what later generations would call the Reconquista, the reconquest. But those who lived through these times did not think in such grand terms. They thought of survival. They thought of land and cattle. They thought of the next harvest and the next battle. The Christian north was a hard land. Rocky hills gave way to vast plateaus. The Meseta, they called it, a high tableland where summers burned hot and winters bit cold. Castles dotted this landscape, like stone sentinels. Indeed, Castile took its very name from these fortifications, the land of castles. Here, warfare was not an occasional disruption to peaceful life. It was life itself. Young men grew up knowing they would fight. The question was never if, but when and where. Below the Christian kingdoms lay something remarkable, the Taifa states. These were the fractured remnants of what had once been a mighty Islamic civilization. Al-Andalus the Arabs called their Iberian territories. For centuries this land had flourished under Muslim rule. Córdoba had shone as one of the brightest jewels of the medieval world. Its libraries held more books than existed in all of Christian Europe combined. Its streets were paved and lit when Paris and London remained muddy villages. Scholars of three faiths had walked its halls, translating the wisdom of ancient Greece and Rome, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost forever. But by the time of our story, that golden age had passed. The great Caliphate of Córdoba had collapsed in 1031, shattering into dozens of petty kingdoms. These Taifa states, as they were known, spent as much time fighting each other as they did resisting the Christian advance. Saragossa in the northeast, Toledo in the centre, Seville in the south, Valencia on the eastern coast, Badajoz in the west, each ruled by its own dynasty, each suspicious of its neighbours, each in its own way vulnerable. This was a world of shifting alliances and pragmatic arrangements. Christian kings hired Muslim soldiers. Muslim rulers paid tribute to Christian lords. A warrior might fight for a cross one year and a crescent the next. Religious identity mattered certainly, but survival and advantage often mattered more. This was the complex, dangerous, endlessly fascinating world into which Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar was born. Let us speak now of the kingdom that would shape him most. Castile. In the early 11th century, Castile was still a young realm, having only recently emerged from the shadow of Leon. For generations, Castile had been merely a county, a frontier territory ruled by counts who answered to the Leonese crown. But in 1035 everything changed. Ferdinand, Count of Castile, inherited the throne of Leon through his wife. Two kingdoms became one, at least for a time. Ferdinand I, as he came to be known, was a capable ruler and a relentless warrior. Under his reign, the combined kingdom of Castile-Leon became the dominant Christian power in Iberia. Ferdinand extracted tribute from the wealthy Taifa states. He pushed the frontier southward. He built churches and endowed monasteries. He also planted the seeds of future conflict by dividing his realm among his sons upon his death. But that story comes later. What matters now is understanding the culture that Ferdinand's kingdom represented. This was a society built for war. The nobility measured their worth in martial prowess. Land meant little without the strength to defend it. Honour was everything, and honour was won on the battlefield. Young nobles trained from childhood in the arts of combat. They learned to ride almost before they could walk. They practiced with wooden swords until they were strong enough to lift steel. They studied the tactics of their fathers and grandfathers, absorbing generations of hard-won military wisdom. Religion provided the framework for this warrior culture. The Church taught that fighting against the Muslims was not merely acceptable but holy. Warriors who fell in battle against the infidel could hope for heavenly reward. This belief gave the endless frontier warfare a cosmic significance. Every skirmish became part of a larger struggle between faiths. Every victory was God's will made manifest. Yet we must be careful not to oversimplify. The reality on the ground was far messier than the religious rhetoric suggested. Christian and Muslim communities had lived side by side for centuries. They traded with each other. They learned from each other. Sometimes they married each other. The frontier was as much a zone of exchange as it was a line of conflict. Merchants crossed it regularly. Scholars moved between courts of different faiths. Diplomatic missions travelled in both directions. The 11th century Iberian Peninsula was, in many ways, one of the most culturally dynamic places in the medieval world. This dynamism extended to language and learning. Arabic was the language of science and philosophy. Latin remained the tongue of the church and formal documents. But the common people spoke evolving Romance dialects that would eventually become Spanish, Portuguese, and Catalan. An educated person might know all three linguistic traditions. A successful warrior needed to communicate across cultural boundaries. El Cid himself would later become famous for his ability to navigate between Christian and Muslim worlds. This skill was not unusual in his time. It was necessary. The economy of 11th century Iberia revolved around several pillars. Agriculture formed the base, as it did everywhere in the medieval world. The northern kingdoms raised cattle and sheep on their rugged highlands. The southern Taifa states cultivated sophisticated irrigation systems inherited from centuries of Islamic engineering. Olives and grapes grew across the peninsula. Wheat and barley fed the populations of both faiths. But warfare also drove the economy in ways both obvious and subtle. Plunder was a legitimate form of wealth acquisition. A successful raid could make a young knight's fortune overnight. Tribute payments from weaker states to stronger ones moved enormous sums of gold and silver across political boundaries. Ransoms for captured nobles provided another source of income. The slave trade, though we may find it abhorrent today, was an accepted part of medieval life. Prisoners taken in battle might be sold, ransomed, or put to work. War was not just politics by other means. It was economics by other means as well. Into this world of complexity and contradiction, a child was born around the year 1043. Some sources say 1040. Others suggest as late as 1048. Medieval records rarely noted the births of those who had not yet proven themselves worthy of remembrance. We cannot know the exact date, but we know the place. Vivar, a small village just north of the city of Burgos in the heartland of Castile. Here, in this unremarkable settlement, began the life of the man who would become El Cid. The village of Vivar sits in a gentle valley watered by the Iberia River. Even today, it remains a quiet place. A few hundred souls live there now. In the 11th century, it would have been smaller still. A cluster of simple houses. A church, perhaps a mill, fields stretching out toward the horizon. This was not a grand setting for the birth of a legend, but legends rarely begin in palaces. They begin in ordinary places with ordinary people who prove themselves extraordinary. Rodrigo's father was Diego Lainez, a minor nobleman, an infanzon, as such men were called in Castile. This rank placed the family above the common peasantry, but well below the great magnates who advised kings and commanded armies. Diego Lainez was a professional soldier, as his father had been before him, and his father before that. The family had served the counts and kings of Castile for generations. They had earned their modest lands through blood and loyalty. We know little of Rodrigo's mother. Some traditions name her as the daughter of Rodrigo Alvarez, another minor noble. The name Rodrigo was common in Castile. Our hero likely received it from this maternal grandfather. Whatever her name and origins, she gave birth to a son who would far surpass anything his parents could have imagined. Such is often the way with greatness. It emerges from unexpected soil. Rodrigo's childhood would have followed patterns familiar to any young noble of his time and place. He would have learned to ride almost as soon as he could walk. Horses were essential in this society. A knight without a horse was barely a knight at all. The boy would have practiced with weapons from an early age. Wooden swords at first, then blunted steel. The skills of combat were drilled into young nobles through endless repetition. Thrust, parry, cut, again, 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 until the movements became instinct, until the sword felt like an extension of the arm. Religious education would have accompanied martial training. The church dominated intellectual life in Christian Iberia. Rodrigo would have learned his prayers and his catechism. He would have absorbed the stories of saints and martyrs. He would have come to understand the cosmic struggle between Christendom and Islam that gave meaning to the endless warfare of his world. Whether he was deeply pious or merely conventionally religious, we cannot say. The sources do not tell us, but faith formed part of the fabric of his existence, as it did for everyone in his society. What set young Rodrigo apart? The sources hint at natural talent, a quickness with weapons that exceeded his peers, a tactical mind that grasped the flow of battle, physical courage that bordered on recklessness. These gifts would have been noticed early. In a society that valued martial prowess above almost everything else, a talented young warrior attracted attention. Rodrigo attracted the attention of the royal court. Sometime in his youth, probably around the age of 14 or 15, Rodrigo entered the household of Prince Sancho, the eldest son of King Ferdinand I. This was a crucial step in any young noble's career. Service in a royal or princely household provided education, connections, and opportunities. The prince's household was a school for future leaders. Here, young men learned not just fighting but politics, diplomacy, and administration. They formed bonds with their fellow courtiers that would shape their entire lives. Prince Sancho was only a few years older than Rodrigo. The two young men grew up together in the competitive atmosphere of the court. They trained together. They hunted together. They learned together the arts of war and rule. A bond formed between them. Sancho recognized Rodrigo's exceptional abilities. Rodrigo gave Sancho his fierce loyalty. This relationship would define the first great chapter of El Cid's career. The court of Ferdinand I was a serious place. The king was a warrior who had spent his life expanding his realm and extracting tribute from Muslim neighbours. He expected his sons to follow in his footsteps. He expected the young nobles of his court to be ready for war at any moment. And war came often. The frontier was never truly quiet. Raids and counter-raids, sieges and skirmishes. The business of medieval kingship was largely the business of organised violence. Ferdinand's court was also a place of learning, at least by the standards of the time. The king patronised monasteries that preserved and copied manuscripts. Scholars found welcome at his table. The influence of the more sophisticated Islamic South filtered northward through trade, tribute, and cultural exchange. A young man at Ferdinand's court might encounter ideas and knowledge far beyond what his village upbringing could have provided. As Rodrigo grew from boy to young man, the kingdom around him was changing. Ferdinand's campaigns had been remarkably successful. The Taifa states paid him enormous sums to leave them in peace. This tribute, called parias, enriched the Castilian treasury and funded further military expansion. The balance of power on the peninsula was shifting. The Christian north was growing stronger. The Muslim south was growing weaker. But this shift was gradual, uneven, and far from inevitable. Many battles remained to be fought. Many reversals lay ahead. In 1063, when Rodrigo was perhaps 20 years old, he experienced his first major battle. The circumstances were unusual. King Ferdinand had agreed to help al-Muqtadir, the Muslim ruler of Zaragoza, against a rival Taifa state. This was the complex reality of Iberian politics. Christian kings, allied with Muslim rulers, against other Muslim rulers. Religious boundaries bent before political necessity. The battle took place at Graus, in what is now Aragon. The enemy was Ramiro I of Aragon, a Christian king. Think about this for a moment. Rodrigo's first great battle was fought alongside Muslims against Christians. He was fighting to help one Islamic kingdom defeat a Christian king. This was not the simple crusading narrative that later legends would construct. This was the messy, pragmatic reality of 11th century Iberia. Alliances followed interests, not faiths. At Graus, Rodrigo distinguished himself. The sources tell us he fought with exceptional bravery. He may have personally killed King Ramiro, though this claim is disputed. What is certain is that he emerged from the battle with an enhanced reputation. He had proven himself in the ultimate test. He had stood firm when men around him fell. He had shown the courage and skill that would define his entire career. The young warrior returned from Graus a changed man. He had seen death up close. He had dealt it with his own hands. He understood now, in his bones and blood, what it meant to be a soldier. The training of his youth had prepared him for this moment. But nothing truly prepares a man for battle except battle itself. Rodrigo had passed through that fire. He would pass through it many more times before his story ended. King Ferdinand I died in 1065. His death set in motion events that would shape the rest of Rodrigo's life. The old king had made a fateful decision. He divided his realm among his 3 sons. Sancho, the eldest, received Castile. Alfonso received Leon. Garcia received Galicia. 2 daughters also received territories. Urraca got the city of Zamora. Elvira got the city of Toro. This division was meant to provide for all of Ferdinand's children. Instead, it guaranteed conflict. Sancho was not satisfied with Castile alone. He believed, as the eldest son, that he should have inherited the entire realm. His brothers felt differently. They intended to keep what their father had given them. The stage was set for civil war. And where Sancho went, Rodrigo followed. The bond forged in their youth would now be tested in the fires of fratricidal conflict. Thus ends our first chapter. We have seen the world that made El Cid. We have traced his origins from the small village of Vivar to the royal court of Castile. We have watched him grow from a promising youth to a battle-tested warrior. Now, as the old king lies in his grave, and his sons eye each other with suspicion, a new chapter begins. The chapter of war, loyalty, and the forging of a legend. The death of Ferdinand I in December of 1065 marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new one. The old king was buried with great ceremony in the church of San Isidoro in Leon, a building he himself had commissioned. His body was laid to rest beside his beloved wife, Queen Sancha, who had preceded him in death. The mourning was genuine. Ferdinand had been a strong king, a successful warrior, and a unifying force. With him gone, the unity he had maintained through strength of will began to fracture. Sancho II, as he now styled himself, was not content with his inheritance. Castile was a proud kingdom, but it was not the whole of his father's realm. Leon, the ancient seat of Christian power in Iberia, had gone to his younger brother Alfonso. This rankled. Sancho believed that primogeniture should have applied. The eldest son should inherit everything. The division of the realm struck him as unjust, perhaps even illegal. He began to plan. Rodrigo Díaz stood at Sancho's side throughout these years of tension and preparation. The king had rewarded his loyal companion with a prestigious position. Rodrigo became the armiger regis, the royal standard-bearer. This was no mere ceremonial role. The standard-bearer led the king's personal guard. He carried the royal banner into battle, marking the king's position for all to see. He was expected to defend that banner with his life. The position required exceptional martial skill and absolute loyalty. Rodrigo possessed both. In his role as armiger regis, Rodrigo also served as a military commander. He led troops in the king's name. He planned campaigns and executed them. He became, in effect, Sancho's right hand in matters of war. The bond between king and warrior deepened. Sancho trusted Rodrigo as he trusted few others. Rodrigo repaid that trust with victories. The first target of Sancho's ambitions was not his brothers, but his cousin, Sancho IV of Navarre. The kingdom of Navarre lay to the east of Castile, nestled in the western Pyrenees. It was a small but strategically important realm. Sancho of Castile believed he had claims to Navarrese territory. In 1067, he moved to press those claims by force. The resulting conflict is sometimes called the War of the Three Sanchos. Three kings named Sancho fighting over borders and honour. The Castilian Sancho allied with the Aragonese king, also named Sancho, against the Navarrese Sancho. Medieval naming conventions could be confusing, but the swords and spears were clear enough. Rodrigo played a significant role in this conflict. He commanded Castilian forces in several engagements. The war was not a single decisive battle, but a series of raids, sieges, and skirmishes. This was typical of medieval warfare. Large set-piece battles were relatively rare. Most fighting consisted of smaller operations designed to weaken the enemy economically and psychologically, burn their crops, steal their cattle, capture their castles, make them bleed slowly until they sue for peace. The War of the Three Sanchos ended inconclusively. No king achieved a decisive victory. Borders shifted slightly. Honour was satisfied, or at least exhausted. But the conflict served as a training ground for Rodrigo. He honed his skills in campaign after campaign. He learned to manage logistics, that unglamorous but essential aspect of warfare. He learned to read terrain and exploit it. He learned to inspire men and lead them into danger. By the time the Navarrese War wound down, Rodrigo Díaz was no longer a promising young warrior. He was a proven commander. Sancho's attention now turned to his brothers. The division of Ferdinand's realm continued to gnaw at him. He wanted Leon. He wanted Galicia. He wanted everything their father had ruled, and he was prepared to take it by force. The first brother to fall was Garcia of Galicia. In 1071, Sancho and Alfonso, temporarily allied, moved against their youngest brother. The campaign was swift and brutal. Garcia's forces were defeated. The young king fled into exile, eventually finding refuge in the Taifa kingdom of Seville. He would spend years wandering, a king without a kingdom, before Sancho finally captured him and threw him into prison. Garcia would die in chains, never regaining his crown. The fate of princes in this era could be cruel indeed. With Galicia secured, Sancho turned on his remaining brother. Alfonso of Leon had helped defeat Garcia. Now he found himself the target. The alliance of convenience dissolved into open warfare. Brother against brother. Castile against Leon. The conflict that Ferdinand had tried to prevent through his division of the realm had arrived despite his efforts. Perhaps because of them. The war between Sancho and Alfonso lasted from 1072 into early 1072. Several battles marked its course. At Lantada in 1068, the brothers had fought to an inconclusive draw, agreeing to settle their differences through negotiation. That negotiation had failed. At Golpejera in January 1072, they met again. This time, the result was decisive. Rodrigo Díaz commanded the Castilian forces at Golpejera. The sources credit him with the victory. His tactical skill turned the battle in Sancho's favour. Alfonso's army was routed. The King of Leon himself was captured. Sancho had won. The realm of Ferdinand I was reunited under a single crown. Or so it seemed. Alfonso was not executed. Fratricide, even in this violent age, carried a heavy stigma. Instead, Sancho sent his brother to the monastery of Sahagún. Alfonso was to take religious vows and spend the rest of his life in prayer and contemplation. His political career was over. His ambitions were to be buried in a monk's cell. But Alfonso had other ideas, and he had a powerful ally. His sister Urraca, who ruled the city of Zamora under the terms of Ferdinand's will, remained loyal to him. Zamora was a fortress city, strategically located and heavily defended. Urraca refused to submit to Sancho. She sheltered Alfonso when he escaped from Sahagún. She defied her eldest brother's demands for surrender. Sancho marched on Zamora. If Urraca would not yield, he would take the city by force. The siege began in 1072. Rodrigo Díaz was there, as always, at his king's side. The Castilian army surrounded the city. They built siege works. They prepared for a long campaign. Zamora's walls were strong. Its defenders were determined. This would not be easy. What happened next changed everything. On October 7th, 1072, a man named Velido Dolfos approached the Castilian camp. He claimed to be a defector from Zamora. He said he had information that would help Sancho take the city. The king agreed to meet with him privately. It was a trap. Velido Dolfos was an assassin. As Sancho rode with him outside the camp, Velido struck. He drove a spear into the king's back. Sancho fell from his horse, mortally wounded. Velido fled towards Zamora's gates, which opened to receive him. The king died within hours. Rodrigo Díaz pursued the assassin. He chased Velido Dolfos toward the city walls, but he was too late. The gates closed before he could catch the killer. Sancho was dead. The man Rodrigo had served since youth, the king he had helped win a kingdom, was gone, murdered by treachery. The death of Sancho II threw everything into chaos. He had no legitimate children. The crown of Castile, and with it Leon and Galicia, passed to the next in line. Alfonso, the brother Sancho, had defeated and imprisoned, the brother who had been sheltering in Zamora when Sancho was killed. The coincidence was suspicious. Many believed Alfonso had arranged the assassination. No proof existed, but suspicion lingered. Alfonso emerged from Zamora to claim his inheritance. He was now Alfonso VI, King of Castile, Leon, and Galicia. The realm Ferdinand had divided was reunited, but under a different son than Ferdinand had probably intended. Alfonso moved quickly to secure his position. He needed the loyalty of Sancho's former supporters. He needed, in particular, the loyalty of Rodrigo Díaz. This was a delicate moment. Rodrigo had been Sancho's most loyal follower. He had defeated Alfonso in battle. He had helped imprison him. Now that same Alfonso was king. Would Rodrigo submit? Would Alfonso accept his submission? The relationship between these two men would shape the next decade of Iberian history. According to tradition, Rodrigo demanded something before he would swear loyalty to Alfonso. He demanded that the new king publicly swear he had no part in Sancho's murder. This ceremony, if it happened, took place in the church of Santa Guardia in Burgos. Rodrigo supposedly made Alfonso swear 3 times on holy relics that he was innocent of his brother's blood. Only then did he kneel and offer his allegiance. This story may be legend rather than history. The earliest sources do not mention it. It appears in later texts, written long after the events they describe. But legend or not, it captures something true about the relationship between Alfonso and Rodrigo. There was tension from the beginning. Alfonso could not fully trust a man who had served his enemy so faithfully. Rodrigo could not fully trust a king who had benefited so conveniently from murder. They needed each other, but they did not love each other. Alfonso confirmed Rodrigo in his positions and honours. The warrior was too valuable to discard. His military reputation was unmatched in Castile. His loyalty, once given, was absolute. Alfonso would use him, but he would also watch him. And he would listen to those at court who whispered against the famous warrior. In 1074, Alfonso arranged a marriage for Rodrigo. The bride was Jimena Diaz, a noblewoman of high birth. She was related to the royal family of León, possibly a niece of Alfonso himself. This marriage elevated Rodrigo's status considerably. He was no longer merely a successful soldier. He was connected by marriage to the royal house. He was becoming a great lord in his own right. The marriage appears to have been a happy one. Rodrigo and Jimena would remain together until his death. They had at least 3 children, a son named Diego, daughters named Cristina and Maria. Jimena would prove herself a worthy partner for her famous husband. In later years, she would rule Valencia in his absence and defend it after his death. She was no mere ornament. She was a capable and courageous woman in her own right. The years following Rodrigo's marriage were busy ones. Alfonso used his best general extensively. Rodrigo led campaigns against the Taifa states, collecting tribute and demonstrating Castilian power. He negotiated with Muslim rulers on Alfonso's behalf. He put down rebellions and secured the frontier. His reputation grew with each success. But success breeds envy. Rodrigo had enemies at court. Other nobles resented his prominence. They whispered to Alfonso that Rodrigo was too powerful, too independent, too dangerous. They reminded the king of Rodrigo's service to Sancho. They suggested that his loyalty might not be absolute. Alfonso listened. He did not act immediately, but the seeds of doubt were planted. In 1079, an incident occurred that would have far-reaching consequences. Rodrigo was leading a force to collect tribute from the Taifa of Seville. While he was engaged in this mission, a raiding party from Granada attacked Seville's territory. Rodrigo responded by attacking the Granadan force. He defeated them decisively, capturing several important nobles. This should have been a triumph, but there was a complication. Among those who had accompanied the Granadan raid were several Castilian nobles. They were allies of Garcia Ordóñez, one of Rodrigo's rivals at court. Garcia Ordóñez himself was captured in the battle. Rodrigo had humiliated a powerful enemy. Garcia Ordóñez was furious. He used his influence with Alfonso to paint Rodrigo's actions in the worst possible light. He claimed Rodrigo had acted without authorization. He suggested the attack had been motivated by personal rivalry rather than royal service. He demanded punishment. Alfonso was inclined to listen. He had never fully trusted Rodrigo. The complaints of Garcia Ordóñez and others confirmed his suspicions. When another incident occurred in 1081, Alfonso found his excuse. The details are disputed. The sources give different accounts. What seems to have happened is this. A raiding force from Toledo attacked Castilian territory while Rodrigo was stationed nearby. Rodrigo pursued the raiders and counterattacked into Toledan territory. He was successful militarily, but Toledo was at that moment under Alfonso's protection. The king had been negotiating with the Taifa of Toledo. Rodrigo's attack disrupted those negotiations. Alfonso was enraged. Whether Rodrigo had acted without orders or had simply exceeded them, the result was the same. The king felt his authority had been challenged. His negotiations had been undermined. His general had embarrassed him. In 1081, Alfonso VI exiled Rodrigo Díaz from Castile. The sentence was formal and public. Rodrigo was given a limited time to leave the kingdom. His lands were confiscated. His honours were stripped. The king's most famous warrior was cast out like a criminal. This was the first exile. There would be a second. But even this first banishment, painful as it was, would prove to be a turning point. Rodrigo Díaz was about to become something more than a Castilian general. He was about to become a legend. Exile. The word carries weight even today. In the 11th century, it was a kind of death. To be exiled was to be cut off from everything that gave life meaning. Family, land, lord, identity. A man in exile was a man adrift, dependent on the charity of strangers, vulnerable to enemies who no longer feared royal protection. Rodrigo Díaz left Castilla in 1081 with a small band of followers. These were men who chose loyalty to their commander over safety in their homeland. They gave up everything to follow him into the unknown. Such loyalty was not given lightly. It was earned through years of shared danger and shared triumph. Rodrigo inspired this devotion. He would continue to inspire it throughout his life. Where could an exiled Castilian warrior go? The Christian kingdoms of the north were largely closed to him. Alfonso's influence extended far. Navarre and Aragon had their own generals. They had no need of a famous exile who might prove troublesome. The options were limited. Rodrigo turned south, to the Taifa states, to the Muslim kingdoms that had been his enemies and sometimes his employers. This was not as strange as it might seem. Christian warriors serving Muslim rulers was common in this period. The Taifas were wealthy. They needed skilled soldiers. They were willing to pay well for military talent, regardless of the religion of the man wielding the sword. The first destination Rodrigo considered was Barcelona. Count Berenguer Ramon II ruled there. The county of Barcelona was Christian technically, but it operated somewhat independently from the other Iberian kingdoms. Rodrigo sent messengers to inquire about employment. The count declined. Perhaps he feared offending Alfonso of Castile. Perhaps he simply did not need another general. Whatever the reason, Barcelona was closed to the exile. Rodrigo then turned to the Taifa of Zaragoza. This kingdom occupied the middle Ebro Valley, a rich and fertile region in northeastern Iberia. Zaragoza was one of the wealthiest and most powerful of the Taifa states. Its rulers, the Banu Hud dynasty, had maintained their independence through a combination of diplomacy, tribute payments, and military strength. They were always looking for capable warriors. The king of Zaragoza in 1081 was Ahmad al-Muqtadir. He was an old man by this point, nearing the end of a long and successful reign. Al-Muqtadir had built Zaragoza into a centre of culture and learning. The Al-Jafaria Palace, his great architectural achievement, still stands today as a testament to his ambition. Its intricate geometric patterns and graceful arches represent the height of Taifa artistic achievement. Al-Muqtadir welcomed Rodrigo Díaz. Here was a famous Christian general exiled from his homeland, offering his sword to whoever would pay for it. The symbolism was valuable. The military capability was even more so. Al-Muqtadir gave Rodrigo a place in his court and a command in his army. The arrangement benefited both parties. Rodrigo gained employment, income, and a base of operations. Zaragoza gained one of the finest military minds in Iberia. The exile had found a new home, at least temporarily. Life in Zaragoza exposed Rodrigo to a different world. The Taifa court was more sophisticated than anything in Christian Castile. Poetry and music flourished. Scholars debated philosophy and science. The material culture was richer, more refined, more luxurious. Rodrigo would have encountered silk and spices, astronomical instruments, and illuminated manuscripts. He would have heard Arabic spoken as the language of high culture. This exposure left its mark. Rodrigo learned to operate in the Muslim world. He picked up Arabic, or at least enough to communicate effectively. He came to understand Islamic customs and courtly protocols. He developed relationships with Muslim rulers and generals that would serve him well in later years. The exile that had seemed like a catastrophe was becoming an education. Al-Muqtadir died in 1081, shortly after Rodrigo's arrival. The old king divided his realm between his two sons, just as Ferdinand of Castile had done a generation earlier. Al-Mutamin received Zaragoza itself. Al-Mundir received the eastern territories, including the cities of Lerida, Tortosa, and Denia. This division, predictably, led to conflict. Rodrigo entered the service of Al-Mutamin, the new king of Zaragoza. His first major task was to defend his new lord against his brother. Al-Mundir had allied with the Count of Barcelona and the King of Aragon. Together, they threatened Zaragoza from the east. Rodrigo was sent to stop them. The campaign that followed demonstrated Rodrigo's military genius. He was operating in unfamiliar territory with limited forces against a coalition of enemies. He used speed and deception to offset his numerical disadvantage. He struck where his enemies did not expect. He avoided battle when the odds were against him, and sought it when they favoured him. In 1082, Rodrigo won a significant victory at Almenar. The details of the battle are not fully recorded, but the outcome is clear. The coalition forces were defeated. Count Berenguer Ramon of Barcelona was captured. This was a remarkable achievement. Rodrigo had humiliated one of the most powerful Christian lords in Iberia while fighting for a Muslim king. The capture of Berenguer Ramon created a diplomatic opportunity. Rodrigo could have killed the count or held him indefinitely. Instead, he negotiated a ransom. The count paid handsomely for his freedom. This was standard practice in medieval warfare. Captured nobles were valuable commodities. Their lives were worth more than their deaths. But Rodrigo's treatment of Berenguer Ramon went beyond mere financial calculation. He treated his prisoner with courtesy and respect. He demonstrated that he was not a mere mercenary, but a man of honour who followed the codes of chivalric conduct. This reputation for honourable dealing would serve Rodrigo well throughout his career. Men who surrendered to him could expect fair treatment. This made enemies more willing to negotiate and less likely to fight to the death. The victory at Almenar secured Rodrigo's position in Zaragoza. Al-Mutamin trusted him completely. The king gave him greater responsibilities and greater rewards. Rodrigo was no longer just a hired sword. He was becoming a power in his own right. In 1084, another major battle occurred, this time at Morella, in the mountainous borderlands between Zaragoza and the eastern coast. Al-Mundir had not given up his ambitions. He attacked again with support from his Christian allies. Again, Rodrigo was sent to stop him. The Battle of Morella was hard fought. The terrain favoured the defenders. Al-Mundir's forces held strong positions in the hills. Rodrigo had to dislodge them through a combination of frontal assault and flanking manoeuvres. The fighting lasted most of a day. When it was over, Rodrigo had won another victory. Al-Mundir himself was killed in the battle, or shortly thereafter. His death removed a persistent threat to Zaragoza. It also eliminated a potential employer for Rodrigo's enemies. The balance of power in northeastern Iberia shifted in Al-Mutamin's favour. These years in Zaragoza were formative for Rodrigo. He learned to command diverse forces. His army included Christians and Muslims, Castilians and Aragonese, men from a dozen different backgrounds. He learned to hold this diverse coalition together through force of personality and shared success. He learned the logistics of extended campaigns in difficult terrain. He learned the politics of the Taifa courts, with their intrigues and shifting alliances. He also accumulated wealth. Successful campaigns brought plunder, ransoms brought gold. Al-Mu'tamin paid his general well. Rodrigo was no longer the modestly prosperous knight who had left Castile. He was becoming rich. Wealth meant power. Power meant options. During these years, Rodrigo maintained contact with his family in Castile. Jimena and the children remained behind when he went into exile. This was painful but practical. Taking a family into the uncertainty of exile would have been dangerous. Leaving them in Castile, under the protection of Jimena's royal connections, was safer. Rodrigo sent money when he could. He hoped for reconciliation with Alfonso. He never stopped thinking of himself as a Castilian. Alfonso, for his part, was having troubles of his own. The Almoravids had arrived. The Almoravids. The name itself carries a sense of menace. These were not the cultured cosmopolitan Muslims of the Taifa courts. These were warriors from the Sahara Desert, fierce, disciplined, fanatically devoted to their austere version of Islam. They would change everything. The Almoravid movement began in the Western Sahara, among the Berber tribes of that harsh region. A religious reformer named Abdallah ibn Yasin had united these tribes under a banner of strict Islamic orthodoxy. His followers called themselves al-Murabitun, those who live in a ribat, a fortified religious community. From this Arabic term comes our word Almoravid. Under Ibn Yasin and his successors, the Almoravids conquered Morocco. They built a new capital at Marrakesh. They created an empire that stretched from the Senegal River to the Mediterranean Sea. They were hungry for more. The Taifa kings of Iberia watched the Almoravid rise with growing alarm. These new powers to the south represented an existential threat. The Almoravids despised the Taifa rulers as decadent and corrupt. They considered the payment of tribute to Christian kings a shameful capitulation. They preached holy war against the infidel. If they crossed into Iberia, the comfortable arrangements that had sustained the Taifas for decades would be swept away. But the Taifa kings faced a dilemma. The Christian kingdoms were pressing them hard. Alfonso VI, in particular, was aggressive and ambitious. In 1085 he achieved his greatest triumph. He conquered Toledo, the ancient Visigothic capital, the city that had fallen to Muslim armies in 711, marking the beginning of Islamic rule in Iberia. For nearly 4 centuries, Toledo had been a jewel of Al-Andalus. Its fall to Alfonso sent shockwaves through the Muslim world. The conquest of Toledo was a turning point. It demonstrated that the Taifa states could not defend themselves against determined Christian aggression. It showed that the balance of power had shifted decisively. The Christian north was no longer merely raiding and extracting tribute. It was conquering and holding territory. The Reconquista, that long, slow process of Christian expansion, had accelerated dramatically. The Taifa kings faced a choice. They could continue to resist the Christians alone, paying tribute and hoping for the best, or they could call for help. They could invite the Almoravids into Iberia. It was a devil's bargain. The Almoravids might defeat the Christians, but they might also turn on their Taifa hosts. The cure might prove worse than the disease. Still, with Toledo fallen and Alfonso's armies threatening further conquests, the Taifa kings felt they had no choice. Al-Mu'tamid of Seville, the most powerful of the Taifa rulers, made the fateful decision. He sent messengers to Yusuf ibn Tashfin, the Almoravid emir, requesting military assistance. When advisors warned him of the danger, al-Mu'tamid reportedly replied that he would rather be a camel driver in Africa than a swineherd in Castile. He was willing to risk everything to stop the Christian advance. Yusuf ibn Tashfin crossed the Strait of Gibraltar in 1086. He brought with him a large army of Almoravid warriors, hardened by years of desert warfare. They were unlike anything the Iberians had seen. They wore black robes and veiled their faces. They fought with different tactics and different weapons. They were utterly committed to their cause. The Almoravid army joined forces with the Taifa contingents. Together, they marched north to confront Alfonso. The Christian king gathered his own forces and moved to meet them. The two armies collided at Sagrayas, near the city of Badajoz, on October 23rd, 1086. The Battle of Sagrayas was a catastrophe for the Christians. Alfonso's army was virtually annihilated. The king himself barely escaped with his life. Thousands of Christian warriors died on that field. The heads of the slain were piled into gruesome pyramids, a traditional Almoravid practice meant to terrify enemies and glorify God. Sagrayas changed everything. The myth of Christian invincibility was shattered. The Taifa kings breathed easier, at least temporarily. Alfonso retreated to lick his wounds and rebuild his forces. The great conquering king had been humbled. Where was Rodrigo during all this? He was still in Zaragoza, still serving al-Mu'tamin. He had not participated in the Sagrayas campaign. His employer had not joined the coalition against Alfonso. Zaragoza had its own concerns, its own enemies, its own priorities. But the aftermath of Sagrayas affected Rodrigo nonetheless. Alfonso, desperate to rebuild his military strength, began to reconsider his treatment of the exile. Rodrigo Díaz was the finest general in Iberia. His skills were needed now more than ever. Pride would have to yield to necessity. In 1087, Alfonso recalled Rodrigo from exile. The terms of the reconciliation are not fully recorded. Rodrigo returned to Castile with his reputation enhanced by his years of success in Zaragoza. He was restored to royal favour, at least officially. His lands were returned. His honours were confirmed. But the reconciliation was uneasy. Alfonso still did not fully trust his famous general. Rodrigo still harboured resentments over his treatment. The court factions that had worked against him before continued their intrigues. The peace between king and warrior was fragile. Rodrigo was given a command in the eastern regions along the frontier with the Taifa states. His task was to defend Christian territory and, if possible, extend it. He was also expected to counter Almoravid influence in the region. The great struggle between Christendom and the Almoravid Empire was just beginning. Rodrigo would play a central role. The years following his return to Castile were busy ones. Rodrigo campaigned extensively in the Levante, the eastern coastal region of Iberia. He extracted tributes from local Taifa rulers. He built alliances with some and made war on others. He operated with considerable independence, as the distance from Alfonso's court allowed. This independence bred suspicion. Rodrigo's enemies at court whispered that he was building his own power base. They suggested he was more interested in his own aggrandizement than in serving the king. They pointed to his wealth, his growing retinue, his network of alliances. Alfonso listened. In 1089, the fragile reconciliation collapsed. The immediate cause was a failed rendezvous. Alfonso had summoned Rodrigo to join a campaign against the fortress of Aledo, which was besieged by Almoravid forces. Rodrigo set out to join the king, but arrived late. The siege had already been lifted. Alfonso had departed. The king was furious. He interpreted Rodrigo's tardiness as deliberate disobedience, perhaps even as cowardice. Rodrigo's enemies fanned the flames. They suggested he had intentionally avoided battle. They questioned his loyalty once again. Alfonso exiled Rodrigo for the second time. This exile was harsher than the first. The king confiscated Rodrigo's lands and properties. He imprisoned Jimena and the children for a time. He made clear that Rodrigo was not merely out of favour, but actively condemned. This second exile would prove permanent. Rodrigo Diaz would never return to Alfonso's service. He would never again be a loyal subject of the Castilian crown. From this point forward, he would make his own way. He would become something unprecedented, a Christian warlord operating independently in the chaos of the Almoravid Wars, a king in all but name. The second exile forced Rodrigo to reinvent himself. He was no longer a royal servant, not even a hired sword for a Taifa king. He was an independent operator, surviving by his wits and his sword in the most dangerous region of Iberia. Rodrigo did not return to Zaragoza this time. Al-Mu'tamin had died in 1085, and his successor, Al-Mustayn II, had his own generals and his own priorities. Besides, Rodrigo had larger ambitions now. He had spent years building relationships throughout the Levante. He knew the terrain, the politics, the opportunities. He would carve out his own domain. The late 1080s and early 1090s saw Rodrigo engaged in constant campaigning. He moved through the eastern coastal regions like a force of nature. He extracted tribute from cities that could pay. He conquered those that could not, or would not. He defeated rival warlords, both Christian and Muslim. He built an army loyal to him personally, not to any king or faith. This army was a remarkable institution. It included Christians from Castile, Aragon, and Catalonia. It included Muslims from various Taifa states. It included adventurers and mercenaries from across Iberia and beyond. What held them together was not religion or nationality, but loyalty to their commander and the promise of plunder. Rodrigo paid well. Success in battle meant loot. Loot meant wealth. Wealth meant security. Men flocked to his banner because following him was profitable. But there was more to it than mere mercenary calculation. Rodrigo inspired genuine devotion. He shared the hardships of campaign with his men. He led from the front in battle. He was fair in dividing spoils. He was loyal to those who were loyal to him. These qualities created bonds that transcended financial interest. The army's composition reflected the complex realities of Iberian society. Christians and Muslims served side by side. They ate together, fought together, sometimes died together. Religious identity mattered, but it was not the only thing that mattered. Shared experience and shared loyalty created a community that crossed confessional lines. Rodrigo's treatment of conquered populations also reflected this complexity. He was not a crusader seeking to convert or expel Muslims. He was a practical ruler seeking to extract wealth and maintain order. When he took control of a city or region, he generally allowed the existing population to remain. Muslims continued to practice their faith. They continued to own property and conduct business. They paid taxes to their new lord, but they were not persecuted. This pragmatic approach served Rodrigo's interests. Expelling populations would have destroyed the economic base he needed to support his army. Persecution would have provoked resistance and rebellion. By ruling with a relatively light hand, Rodrigo maintained stability and maximized revenue. He was building a sustainable enterprise, not conducting a holy war. The main theatre of Rodrigo's operations was the region around Valencia. This wealthy coastal city dominated the fertile huerta, the irrigated agricultural land that made the region one of the most productive in Iberia. Valencia was ruled by its own Taifa dynasty, the descendants of Abdelaziz al-Mansur. But the city was weak, caught between Christian pressure from the north and Almoravid pressure from the south. Rodrigo initially approached Valencia as a protector rather than a conqueror. He offered his military services to the ruling dynasty in exchange for tribute and influence. This arrangement suited everyone, at least temporarily. Valencia got protection from its enemies. Rodrigo got income and a base of operations. The relationship was that of patron and client, lord and dependent. But Rodrigo's ambitions grew. He saw Valencia not just as a source of tribute, but as a prize worth taking for himself. The city was wealthy. Its location was strategic. Its agricultural hinterland could support a substantial military force. If Rodrigo could take Valencia, he would have something no other Christian lord in Iberia possessed: an independent principality in the heart of Muslim territory. The path to conquest was gradual. Rodrigo tightened his grip on Valencia slowly, over several years. He intervened in the city's internal politics. He installed rulers favourable to his interests. He removed those who opposed him. He built fortifications in the surrounding countryside. He established a network of alliances and dependencies that made Valencia increasingly reliant on his protection. The Almoravids complicated matters. After their victory at Sagrejas, they had not immediately followed up with further conquests. Yusuf ibn Tashfin returned to Africa, leaving only a small force in Iberia. But the Almoravid presence grew over time. They began to absorb the Taifa states one by one. Seville fell to them in 1091. Granada followed. The Almoravids were building an empire in Iberia, and Valencia lay in their path. Rodrigo found himself in a three-way struggle. He was competing with the Almoravids for control of the Levante. He was also competing with Alfonso of Castile, who had his own designs on the region, and he was dealing with the local Taifa rulers, who tried to play the various powers against each other. In 1092, the situation in Valencia reached a crisis. The ruling emir, Al-Qadir, was a weak and unpopular figure. He had maintained his position only through Rodrigo's support. Opposition to his rule grew. A faction within the city conspired with the Almoravids to overthrow him. The conspiracy succeeded. Al-Qadir was murdered in October 1092. The conspirators opened Valencia's gates to the Almoravids. It seemed that Rodrigo had lost his client state to his greatest enemies. But the Almoravid occupation was brief and chaotic. The new rulers alienated the population with their harsh policies. Resistance grew. The Almoravid garrison was small and isolated. Rodrigo saw his opportunity. In the summer of 1093, Rodrigo began the siege of Valencia. It would last for nearly 2 years. It would be the defining campaign of his career. The siege of Valencia was not a single dramatic assault. It was a long, grinding campaign of attrition. Rodrigo understood that Valencia's walls were too strong to take by storm. He would have to starve the city into submission. The first step was to isolate Valencia from outside help. Rodrigo's forces occupied the surrounding countryside. They seized the fortifications that controlled access to the city. They cut the roads and blocked the ports. Valencia was surrounded. Inside the city, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The Almoravid garrison was too small to break the siege. Supplies ran short, prices soared. The population began to suffer. The siege tested Rodrigo's abilities as a commander and a politician. He had to maintain his army in the field for months on end. He had to keep his diverse coalition of followers united and motivated. He had to fend off attempts by outside powers to relieve the city or disrupt his operations. Alfonso of Castile was one such outside power. The king had not forgotten his ambitions in the Levante. He launched a campaign into the region in 1093, hoping to take advantage of the chaos. Rodrigo had to divert forces to counter this threat while maintaining the siege of Valencia. The confrontation between Rodrigo and Alfonso never came to open battle. Neither man wanted to fight the other directly. Alfonso was not confident of victory against his former general. Rodrigo did not want to make a permanent enemy of the Castilian king. The two forces manoeuvred and skirmished but avoided decisive engagement. Eventually, Alfonso withdrew. The siege continued. The Almoravids also attempted to relieve Valencia. They sent forces north from their bases in southern Iberia, but these relief attempts were poorly coordinated and inadequately supplied. Rodrigo defeated them in detail, destroying each force before it could reach the city. As the siege dragged on, conditions inside Valencia became desperate. Food supplies were exhausted. People ate horses, dogs, rats, anything they could find. Disease spread through the weakened population. The death toll mounted. The Almoravid governor, Ibn Jahaf, tried to negotiate. He offered tribute. He offered submission. He offered anything that might lift the siege. Rodrigo refused. He wanted Valencia itself, not tribute or promises. He would accept nothing less than unconditional surrender. By early 1094, Valencia could hold out no longer. The city's leaders agreed to capitulate. On June 15, 1094, Rodrigo Díaz entered Valencia as its conqueror and new lord. The fall of Valencia was a sensation throughout Iberia and beyond. A Christian warlord had taken one of the great cities of Al-Andalus. He had done it not as a servant of any king, but as an independent power. He had defeated the fearsome Almoravids in the process. The achievement was unprecedented. Rodrigo's entry into Valencia was carefully staged. He wanted to project power and legitimacy. He wore his finest armour. He rode his famous war horse, Babieca. His army marched in disciplined formation. The message was clear. A new lord had arrived. Order would be maintained. Resistance was futile. The treatment of the conquered city was relatively mild. Rodrigo did not massacre the population or expel the Muslims. He allowed them to remain in their homes and continue their lives. He did impose new taxes and confiscate some properties. He installed his own officials in positions of authority. But he did not attempt to transform Valencia into a purely Christian city. This moderation was partly pragmatic. Rodrigo needed Valencia's economy to function. He needed its artisans and merchants to continue their work. He needed its farmers to tend their fields. Mass expulsion or persecution would have destroyed the wealth he had fought so hard to capture. But there may have been more to it than mere calculation. Rodrigo had spent years living and working among Muslims. He had commanded Muslim soldiers. He had allied with Muslim rulers. He understood their culture and respected their capabilities. He was not driven by religious hatred. He was driven by ambition, certainly, and by the desire for wealth and power. But hatred did not seem to be part of his makeup. One exception to this general moderation deserves mention. Ibn Jahaf, the Almoravid governor who had surrendered the city, was executed. The sources say he was burned alive. This was an unusually harsh punishment, even by medieval standards. The reasons are not entirely clear. Ibn Jahaf may have been implicated in the murder of Al-Qadir, Rodrigo's former client. He may have hidden treasure that Rodrigo wanted. He may simply have been made an example to discourage future resistance. Whatever the reason, Ibn Jahaf's execution was a reminder that Rodrigo could be ruthless when he chose. The mild treatment of the general population should not obscure this fact. Rodrigo was a product of his violent age. He did what he felt necessary to maintain his power. Sometimes that meant mercy, sometimes it meant terror. With Valencia secured, Rodrigo set about consolidating his conquest. He repaired the city's fortifications. He strengthened his garrison. He established a system of government that could function in his absence. He was building not just a military occupation, but a lasting regime. Jimena and the children joined him in Valencia. The family was reunited after years of separation. Rodrigo was now a prince, in fact, if not in title. He ruled a wealthy city and its surrounding territory. He commanded a powerful army. He was one of the most significant figures in Iberia. But the Almoravids had not forgotten their defeat. They would return. The conquest of Valencia made Rodrigo a target. The Almoravids could not allow a Christian lord to hold such a strategically important city. It was an affront to their prestige. It was a threat to their ambitions. It had to be reversed. In the autumn of 1094, just months after Valencia's fall, the Almoravids launched a major expedition to retake the city. A large army marched north from their bases in southern Iberia. They were determined to crush Rodrigo and restore Valencia to Muslim rule. Rodrigo did not wait behind Valencia's walls. He understood that a purely defensive strategy would eventually fail. The Almoravids had vast resources. They could sustain a siege far longer than he could endure one. His only chance was to defeat them in the field. The two armies met at Cuarte, just outside Valencia, in October 1094. The Battle of Cuarte was one of the most significant engagements of the Almoravid Wars. Rodrigo faced a larger force, but he had advantages of his own. His men were veterans, hardened by years of campaigning. They knew the terrain. They trusted their commander absolutely. The battle was fierce. The Almoravids attacked with their characteristic discipline and ferocity. Their drums thundered. Their warriors charged in waves. They expected to overwhelm the Christian defenders through sheer weight of numbers. But Rodrigo's men held firm. They absorbed the Almoravid assault and then counterattacked. Rodrigo himself led the decisive charge. He struck at the Almoravid centre, where their commander directed the battle. The impact was devastating. The Almoravid army broke. What had begun as an orderly assault became a chaotic rout. Rodrigo's cavalry pursued the fleeing enemy for miles, cutting down those they caught. The Almoravid dead littered the plain. Their camp was captured, along with enormous quantities of supplies and treasure. Cuarte was a stunning victory. It demonstrated that the Almoravids could be beaten in open battle. It secured Rodrigo's hold on Valencia, at least for the moment. It enhanced his already legendary reputation. The spoils of Cuarte enriched Rodrigo and his followers. Gold, silver, weapons, horses, all the wealth of the Almoravid army fell into Christian hands. Rodrigo distributed the plunder generously, rewarding those who had fought beside him. This generosity reinforced the loyalty of his men. It also attracted new recruits. Success bred success. The years following Cuarte were relatively peaceful for Valencia. The Almoravids did not immediately attempt another major assault. They were occupied elsewhere, consolidating their hold on southern Iberia and dealing with internal challenges. Rodrigo used this respite to strengthen his position. He extended his control over the surrounding region. Towns and fortresses that had resisted now submitted. The territory under Rodrigo's rule expanded steadily. He was building a principality that stretched along the eastern coast and inland toward the mountains. He also worked to legitimize his rule. He sought recognition from the church, presenting himself as a defender of Christendom against the Almoravid threat. He maintained diplomatic contacts with other Christian rulers, including Alfonso of Castile. The old enmity between them never fully healed, but a working relationship developed. Alfonso recognized Rodrigo's value as a buffer against the Almoravids, even if he resented his independence. Rodrigo's court at Valencia became a centre of power and culture. Poets and scholars gathered there. Merchants brought goods from across the Mediterranean. The city thrived under its new lord. Christians and Muslims coexisted, if not always harmoniously, at least peacefully. The religious situation in Valencia was complex. Rodrigo allowed Muslims to continue practicing their faith, but he also promoted Christianity. He converted Valencia's main mosque into a cathedral. He brought in a bishop, a French cleric named Jerome, to lead the Christian community. He encouraged Christian settlement in the city and its surroundings. This dual policy reflected Rodrigo's pragmatic approach. He needed Muslim cooperation to maintain the economy. But he also needed Christian support to legitimize his rule and attract settlers. He balanced these competing demands with considerable skill. In 1097, the Almoravids returned. Another large army marched against Valencia. This time, they were determined to succeed where the Cuarte expedition had failed. The Battle of Bayren, fought in early 1097, was another test of Rodrigo's military abilities. Once again, he faced a larger force. Once again, he chose to meet them in the field rather than endure a siege. Once again, he won. The details of Bayren are less well documented than those of Cuarte, but the outcome is clear. The Almoravid army was defeated. Rodrigo's hold on Valencia was confirmed. His reputation as an invincible commander was reinforced. 2 major battles, 2 decisive victories. Rodrigo had proven that he could not only take Valencia, but hold it against the most powerful military force in the Islamic world. This was an extraordinary achievement. No other Christian commander of his generation could match it. The victories at Cuarte and Bayren had strategic implications beyond Valencia itself. They demonstrated the limits of Almoravid power. They showed that the Almoravid advance could be stopped. They gave hope to other Christian rulers who faced the Almoravid threat. Rodrigo became a symbol of Christian resistance. His fame spread throughout Europe. Pilgrims and crusaders, travelling to the Holy Land, heard stories of the great warrior who held Valencia against the infidel. His legend began to take shape, even during his lifetime. But legends often obscure the human being behind them. Rodrigo was not just a warrior. He was a husband, a father, a ruler. He had to manage the daily business of governing a diverse population. He had to make decisions about taxes and justice, trade and diplomacy. He had to deal with the mundane challenges that face any ruler. His family was with him in Valencia. Jimena managed the household, and when necessary, stood in for her husband during his absences. Their son Diego was growing into a young man, learning the skills he would need to succeed his father. Their daughters, Cristina and Maria, were reaching marriageable age. Rodrigo arranged advantageous matches for them, connecting his family to the royal houses of Navarre and Barcelona. These marriages were political alliances as much as family arrangements. By marrying his daughters to princes, Rodrigo elevated his dynasty. He created bonds with powerful neighbours. He ensured that his legacy would extend beyond his own lifetime. The minor nobleman from Vivar was founding a dynasty. The late 1090s found Rodrigo at the height of his power. He ruled Valencia and its surrounding territory. He commanded a veteran army. He had defeated every enemy who had challenged him. He was wealthy, respected, feared. He had achieved more than anyone could have predicted for the young knight who had once served in Prince Sancho's household. But time was passing. Rodrigo was no longer a young man. The exact year of his birth is uncertain, but by the late 1090s he was probably in his mid-50s. This was old age by medieval standards. A lifetime of warfare had taken its toll. The body that had carried him through countless battles was wearing down. The sources give us few details about Rodrigo's final years. We know he continued to rule Valencia. We know he maintained his military readiness. We know he watched the Almoravids with wary attention. But the great campaigns were behind him. The time for consolidation had arrived. In 1097, Rodrigo suffered a personal tragedy. His son Diego was killed in battle. The young man had been fighting against the Almoravids at the Battle of Consuegra, serving in the army of Alfonso VI. He died bravely, by all accounts, but he died nonetheless. The loss of his only son was devastating. Diego had been Rodrigo's heir, the one who would carry on his legacy. With Diego gone, the future of everything Rodrigo had built became uncertain. He had daughters, but medieval society did not easily accept female rulers. Valencia would need a strong hand to defend it against the Almoravids. That hand would not be Diego's. Rodrigo bore his grief, as he had borne every other challenge, with stoic determination. He continued to rule. He continued to plan. He continued to prepare for the threats he knew would come. But something had changed. The future he had imagined was no longer possible. The year 1099 brought another blow. Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar, the man history would remember as El Cid, died in Valencia. The exact date is recorded as July 10th, 1099. He was approximately 56 years old, though the uncertainty about his birth year makes precision impossible. The cause of death is not recorded with certainty. Some sources suggest illness. Others hint at wounds that never fully healed. The most likely explanation is simply the accumulated toll of a lifetime spent in warfare. 56 years was a long life for a medieval warrior. Most men who lived by the sword died by it long before reaching such an age. Rodrigo had defied the odds for decades. Eventually, even he could not defy them forever. The death occurred in Valencia, the city he had conquered and ruled for 5 years. He died in his own bed, surrounded by his family. Jimena was there. His daughters were there. The loyal companions who had followed him through exile and triumph were there. It was a peaceful end for a man who had known so little peace in his life. The news of Rodrigo's death spread quickly. It reached the courts of Christian kings and Muslim emirs alike. Everywhere, people understood that something significant had happened. A giant had fallen. The balance of power in Iberia would shift once again. In Valencia, the immediate concern was practical. The city still faced the Almoravid threat. Without Rodrigo to defend it, how long could it hold? Jimena took charge. She had learned much from her husband over the years. She understood the military situation. She understood the political realities. She would do what she could. Jimena sent messengers to Alfonso VI, requesting assistance. The old enmity between Alfonso and Rodrigo was irrelevant now. Valencia was a Christian outpost in hostile territory. It needed help to survive. Alfonso, whatever his personal feelings, could not ignore this strategic reality. Alfonso responded. He sent forces to reinforce Valencia's garrison. He provided supplies and money. He recognized that holding Valencia served Castilian interests, even if he had never reconciled with its former lord. The city would be defended, but the defense could not last forever. The Almoravids were too strong. Valencia was too isolated. Without Rodrigo's military genius, the Christians could not hope to hold the city against determined assault. The Almoravids launched their final campaign against Valencia in 1102. 3 years after Rodrigo's death, they returned in force. Jimena and the Castilian garrison resisted as long as they could, but the outcome was inevitable. The city could not be held. Alfonso made a difficult decision. Rather than lose Valencia to the Almoravids intact, he ordered its evacuation. The Christian population was removed. The city's treasures were carried away. And then, In a final act of denial, Valencia was burned. The flames consumed much of what Rodrigo had built, the palace where he had ruled, the fortifications he had strengthened, the cathedral that had once been a mosque. All were destroyed. The Almoravids would take Valencia, but they would take only ashes. Jimena left Valencia with the retreating Christian forces. She brought with her something precious, the body of her husband. Rodrigo would not be left behind for the Almoravids to desecrate. He would be buried in Christian soil. The journey from Valencia to Castile was long and dangerous. The column of refugees and soldiers moved slowly through hostile territory. They carried their dead lord with them, preserved as best they could against the summer heat. It was a sombre procession, a funeral march across the breadth of Iberia. The final destination was the monastery of San Pedro de Cardeña, near Burgos. This was Rodrigo's homeland, the region where he had been born and raised. Here, in the shadow of the Castilian hills, he would find his final rest. The burial at Cardeña was conducted with appropriate ceremony. Rodrigo was laid to rest as befitted a great lord and warrior. The monks of the monastery would tend his grave and preserve his memory. In time, they would also embellish it. The legend of El Cid would grow within these walls. Jimena survived her husband by several years. She lived quietly, probably at the monastery or nearby. She had been a worthy partner to a remarkable man. She had shared his triumphs and his sorrows. She had ruled Valencia in his absence and defended it after his death. Her own story deserves more attention than history has given it. The daughters, Cristina and Maria, lived on as well. Their marriages to the princes of Navarre and Barcelona connected Rodrigo's bloodline to the royal houses of Iberia. Through them, the blood of El Cid would flow into the veins of future kings and queens. His genetic legacy, if not his political legacy, would endure. Death was not the end of Rodrigo Díaz. In many ways, it was only the beginning. The man who died in Valencia in 1099 was a successful warrior and ruler. The legend that emerged in the following centuries was something far greater. It was a symbol, an ideal, a myth that would shape Spanish identity for 1,000 years. The transformation from man to legend began almost immediately. The monks of San Pedro de Cardeña, who guarded Rodrigo's tomb, had every incentive to promote his memory. A famous grave attracted pilgrims. Pilgrims brought donations. Donations supported the monastery. The monks began to collect and embellish stories about their illustrious resident. These early stories emphasized Rodrigo's piety and his service to Christendom. The complex reality of his career, with its service to Muslim rulers and its conflicts with Christian kings, was simplified. Rodrigo became a crusader, a champion of the faith, a holy warrior. This was not entirely false, but it was not entirely true either. It was legend. The oral tradition grew over the decades. Jongleurs and troubadours sang of El Cid's exploits. Each retelling added new details, new adventures, new miracles. The historical Rodrigo was buried beneath layers of embellishment. The legendary Cid emerged in his place. The most important literary monument to this legend is the Cantar de mi Cid, the Song of my Cid. This epic poem was composed sometime around 1200, roughly a century after Rodrigo's death. It is the oldest surviving work of Spanish literature and one of the great medieval epics of Europe. The cantar tells the story of Rodrigo's exile and his conquest of Valencia. It depicts him as the perfect knight, loyal, brave, pious, generous. It shows his relationships with his family, his followers, his enemies. It creates a vivid portrait of a man and his world. But the cantar is not history, it is poetry. The author, whoever he was, shaped his material for artistic and ideological purposes. He invented episodes that never happened. He omitted events that did not fit his narrative. He transformed a complex historical figure into a literary hero. Consider the Cantar's treatment of Rodrigo's exile. In the poem, Rodrigo is banished unjustly by a king who has been deceived by jealous courtiers. Rodrigo accepts his fate with dignity. He never speaks ill of the king. He continues to serve Castile's interests, even in exile. When he conquers Valencia, he sends tribute to Alfonso, acknowledging the king's ultimate authority. This portrayal emphasizes Rodrigo's loyalty and humility. It makes him a model vassal, faithful even when wronged. It reflects the values that medieval society wanted to promote. Lords should be just. Vassals should be loyal. The social order should be maintained. The historical reality was messier. Rodrigo's exiles resulted from genuine conflicts with Alfonso. He did serve Muslim rulers against Christians. He did build an independent power base that challenged royal authority. He was not always the humble, obedient vassal the Cantar depicts. But legends are not about historical accuracy. They are about meaning. The legend of El Cid meant something to the people who created and preserved it. It gave them a hero to admire and emulate. It provided a model of ideal behaviour. It helped define what it meant to be Spanish. The Cantar de mi Cid also provides our most vivid portraits of Rodrigo's family life. The poem depicts his tender relationship with Jimena and his daughters. It shows his grief at leaving them when he goes into exile. It celebrates their reunion when he summons them to Valencia. These scenes humanize the legendary warrior. They show that even the greatest hero is also a husband and father. The poem's most dramatic episodes involve the marriages of Rodrigo's daughters. In the Cantar, they are married to the Infantes of Carrion, two noblemen who prove to be cowardly and cruel. The Infantes abuse their wives and abandon them in a forest. Rodrigo demands justice. The matter is settled by judicial combat, in which Rodrigo's champions defeat the Infantes. The daughters are then married to the princes of Navarre and Aragon. This storyline is largely fictional. The historical marriages of Rodrigo's daughters were different from what the poem describes, but the fictional version served the poet's purposes. It allowed him to explore themes of honour, justice, and family loyalty. It provided dramatic conflict and satisfying resolution. It made for a better story. The Cantar de mi Cid was not the only literary work to celebrate Rodrigo. Other poems and chronicles followed. The legend grew and evolved over the centuries. Each generation added its own interpretations and embellishments. In the later Middle Ages, the legend took on increasingly religious overtones. Rodrigo was depicted as a crusader, fighting to reclaim Spain for Christianity. Miracles were attributed to him. His tomb at Cardenha became a site of pilgrimage. He was not officially canonized, but he was venerated almost as a saint. This religious interpretation reflected the changing context of Spanish history. The Reconquista continued for centuries after Rodrigo's death. Granada, the last Muslim kingdom in Iberia, did not fall until 1492. Throughout this long struggle, the legend of El Cid served as inspiration. He was the model Christian warrior, the hero who had shown that the Muslims could be defeated. The conquest of Granada in 1492 marks the end of the Reconquista, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter in El Cid's legendary career. Spain was now a unified Christian kingdom, soon to become the centre of a global empire. The legend of El Cid became part of Spanish national identity. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Spanish writers continued to celebrate their medieval hero. Plays and poems retold his story. The most famous of these was Le Cid, a tragedy by the French playwright Pierre Corneille, first performed in 1636. Corneille's play focused on the conflict between love and duty, using the Cid legend as its vehicle. The Cid was enormously influential. It established the Cid as a figure of European, not just Spanish significance. It introduced new generations to the legend. It also sparked controversy. French critics attacked Corneille for his treatment of the material. The resulting debate, known as the Querelle du Cid, was one of the great literary controversies of the 17th century. The Enlightenment brought a more skeptical approach to the Cid legend. Scholars began to distinguish between the historical Rodrigo and the legendary El Cid. They examined the sources critically. They questioned the miracles and embellishments. They tried to recover the real man behind the myth. This scholarly work continued through the 19th and 20th centuries. Historians pieced together the documentary evidence. They studied the Arabic sources as well as the Christian ones. They reconstructed, as best they could, the actual career of Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar. The conquest of Granada in 1492 marks the end of the Reconquista, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter in El Cid's legendary career. Spain was now a unified Christian kingdom, soon to become the centre of a global empire. The legend of El Cid became part of Spanish national identity. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Spanish writers continued to celebrate their medieval hero. Plays and poems retold his story. The most famous of these was Le Cid, a tragedy by the French playwright Pierre Corneille, first performed in 1636. Corneille's play focused on the conflict between love and duty, using the Cid legend as its vehicle. The Cid was enormously influential. It established the Cid as a figure of European, not just Spanish significance. It introduced new generations to the legend. It also sparked controversy. French critics attacked Corneille for his treatment of the material. The resulting debate, known as the Querelle du Cid, was one of the great literary controversies of the 17th century. The Enlightenment brought a more skeptical approach to the Cid legend. Scholars began to distinguish between the historical Rodrigo and the legendary El Cid. They examined the sources critically. They questioned the miracles and embellishments. They tried to recover the real man behind the myth. This scholarly work continued through the 19th and 20th centuries. Historians pieced together the documentary evidence. They studied the Arabic sources as well as the Christian ones. They reconstructed, as best they could, the actual career of Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar. The results of this scholarship have given us a more complex and more interesting figure than the legend alone provides. The historical Rodrigo was not a simple crusading hero. He was a man of his time, operating in a world of shifting alliances and pragmatic calculations. He served Muslims as well as Christians. He fought for pay as well as for faith. He was ambitious, ruthless, and supremely talented. But the legend persists alongside the history. Both are true in their different ways. The historical Rodrigo tells us about the 11th century. The legendary El Cid tells us about the centuries that followed, and about the human need for heroes. Let us step back from the chronological narrative and consider Rodrigo Díaz as a military commander. What made him so successful? What can we learn from his campaigns and battles? These questions have fascinated military historians for centuries. The first thing to note is Rodrigo's remarkable record of success. In a career spanning more than 3 decades, he never lost a major battle. He fought against Christians and Muslims, against Castilians and Catalans, against Taifa armies and Almoravid hosts. He always won. This consistency suggests not luck but genuine skill. Rodrigo's military abilities can be analysed in several categories: tactical skill, strategic vision, leadership, logistics, intelligence gathering. He excelled in all of these areas, At the tactical level, Rodrigo understood how to use terrain to his advantage. The battles at Almenar, Morella, Cuarte, and Bayern all demonstrated this. He chose his ground carefully. He positioned his forces to maximize their strengths and minimize their weaknesses. He used natural features like hills and rivers to channel enemy attacks and protect his flanks. He also understood the importance of timing. Medieval battles were often decided by the moment of the decisive charge. Charge too early, and your forces would be exhausted when they reached the enemy. Charge too late, and the enemy would have time to prepare. Rodrigo consistently got the timing right. His charges struck at the moment of maximum impact. The composition of Rodrigo's forces also contributed to his tactical success. He commanded a mixed army of heavy cavalry, light cavalry, and infantry. The heavy cavalry, armoured knights on armoured horses, provided shock power. The light cavalry, often mounted on faster horses, provided mobility and reconnaissance. The infantry held ground and supported the cavalry. Rodrigo knew how to coordinate these different elements. He used his light cavalry to screen his movements and gather information about the enemy. He used his infantry to fix the enemy in place. He used his heavy cavalry to deliver the decisive blow. This combined arms approach was sophisticated for its time. At the strategic level, Rodrigo demonstrated a clear understanding of objectives and priorities. He did not fight for the sake of fighting. He fought to achieve specific goals. During his exile, that goal was survival and the accumulation of resources. During the Valencia campaign, it was the conquest and defence of a territorial base. Every battle served a larger purpose. Rodrigo also understood the importance of logistics. An army marches on its stomach, as Napoleon would later observe. Rodrigo ensured that his forces were supplied. He planned his campaigns around the availability of food and forage. He captured enemy supplies when he could. He maintained lines of communication to his bases. This logistical competence allowed Rodrigo to sustain extended campaigns. The siege of Valencia lasted nearly 2 years. Most medieval armies would have disintegrated long before that. Rodrigo's forces held together because they were fed, paid, and confident of eventual success. Intelligence gathering was another area of strength. Rodrigo always seemed to know what his enemies were doing. He had networks of informants and spies. He cultivated relationships with merchants and travellers who could provide information. He interrogated prisoners carefully. This intelligence allowed him to anticipate enemy movements and avoid surprises. Leadership was perhaps Rodrigo's greatest asset. He inspired fierce loyalty in his followers. Men who served under him rarely deserted. They followed him into exile. They fought beside him against overwhelming odds. They trusted him with their lives. This loyalty was earned, not demanded. Rodrigo shared the hardships of campaign with his men. He ate what they ate. He slept where they slept. He exposed himself to the same dangers they faced. He led from the front in battle, not from the rear. He was also fair in distributing rewards. When plunder was taken, it was divided according to established rules. Everyone received their share. This fairness built trust. Men knew that if they followed Rodrigo to victory, they would benefit from that victory. Rodrigo's treatment of enemies also contributed to his success. He was not gratuitously cruel. Prisoners who surrendered could expect reasonable treatment. Cities that submitted were not sacked. This reputation made enemies more willing to negotiate and less likely to resist to the death. The contrast with the Almoravids is instructive. The Almoravids were feared for their ferocity. They piled the heads of the slain into pyramids. They showed little mercy to those who resisted. This approach had its uses. It terrified enemies into submission. but it also encouraged desperate resistance. Cities facing Almoravid assault knew they had nothing to gain by surrender. They might as well fight to the end. Rodrigo's more measured approach gave enemies options. They could resist and face defeat, or they could submit and be treated fairly. Many chose submission. This saved Rodrigo the cost of prolonged sieges and bloody assaults. The military innovations of the 11th century also played to Rodrigo's strengths. This was a period of transition in Iberian warfare. The old style of raiding and skirmishing was giving way to more organized campaigns. Castles were becoming more sophisticated, siege techniques were improving, professional soldiers were replacing feudal levies. Rodrigo embraced these changes. He built and improved fortifications. He conducted sieges with patience and skill. He maintained a professional army rather than relying on seasonal levies. He adapted to the changing nature of warfare. His experience fighting for Muslim rulers also gave him advantages. He learned Taifa and Almoravid tactics. He understood their strengths and weaknesses. He knew how they thought and how they fought. This knowledge proved invaluable when he faced them as enemies. The battles against the Almoravids deserve special attention. The Almoravids were the most formidable military force in the Western Mediterranean. They had conquered Morocco and much of Iberia. They had destroyed a Castilian army at Sagrajas. They were considered virtually invincible. Rodrigo defeated them twice at Cuarte and Bayran. How did he do it? The key was understanding Almoravid tactics and finding ways to counter them. The Almoravids relied on disciplined infantry and aggressive cavalry charges. Their infantry formed dense formations that were difficult to break. Their cavalry attacked in waves, seeking to overwhelm the enemy through repeated assaults. Rodrigo countered this with a combination of defensive solidity and offensive timing. He allowed the Almoravid waves to spend themselves against his lines. He kept his heavy cavalry in reserve, waiting for the right moment. When the Almoravids were exhausted and disordered, he launched his counterattack. The fresh Christian cavalry struck the tired Almoravid forces with devastating effect. This approach required discipline and patience. Rodrigo's men had to endure the Almoravid assault without breaking. They had to trust that their commander would find the right moment to strike. This trust was the product of years of shared experience and demonstrated success. The victories over the Almoravids had significance beyond their immediate military impact. They showed that the Almoravids could be beaten. They demonstrated that Christian forces, properly led, could hold their own against the best the Islamic world could offer. They provided a model for future commanders to study and emulate. Rodrigo's military legacy extended beyond his own lifetime. His campaigns were studied by later generations of Spanish commanders. His tactics influenced the continuing Reconquista. His example inspired those who came after him. The legend of El Cid as an invincible warrior was rooted in historical reality. Rodrigo Díaz was genuinely one of the great military commanders of the medieval period. His record of success speaks for itself. His methods repay careful study even today. Rodrigo Díaz died in 1099. The world he left behind was very different from the world into which he had been born. Let us consider what had changed during his lifetime and what would change in the years after his death. When Rodrigo was born, around 1043, the Iberian Peninsula was divided between Christian kingdoms in the north and Muslim Taifa states in the south. The balance of power slightly favoured the Christians, who were expanding at Muslim expense, but the expansion was slow and the outcome was far from certain. By the time of Rodrigo's death, the situation had transformed. The Almoravids had arrived, sweeping away most of the Taifa states and creating a new unified Muslim power in Iberia. The Christian kingdoms faced a more formidable enemy than they had confronted in generations. The easy gains of the mid-11th century had given way to hard fighting and uncertain outcomes. Valencia, Rodrigo's great conquest, did not long survive him. As we have seen, it was evacuated and burned in 1102. The Almoravids reoccupied the city and held it for decades. Rodrigo's principality vanished as if it had never existed. But his impact on the broader struggle was more lasting. The victories at Cuarte and Bayrin had shown that the Almoravids could be defeated. This knowledge sustained Christian resistance during the difficult years that followed. The legend of El Cid provided inspiration even when his conquests had been lost. The Almoravid period in Iberia lasted until the mid-12th century. Like the Taifas before them, the Almoravids eventually fragmented. A new wave of invaders, the Almohads, replaced them. The cycle of unity and fragmentation, invasion and resistance continued. The Christian kingdoms also evolved. Castile and Leon were reunited permanently in 1230. Aragon expanded along the Mediterranean coast. Portugal emerged as an independent kingdom. The political map of Iberia was being redrawn. The Reconquista continued for centuries after Rodrigo's death. The great battles of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212 and Salado in 1340 marked turning points. Córdoba fell to the Christians in 1236. Seville followed in 1248. By the late 13th century, only the Kingdom of Granada remained under Muslim rule. Granada survived for another 2 centuries, a tributary state that posed no serious threat to its Christian neighbours. Its final conquest in 1492 by Ferdinand and Isabella marks the end of the Reconquista. Muslim political power in Iberia was extinguished after nearly 800 years. Throughout this long process, the memory of El Cid served as inspiration. He was the model Christian warrior, the hero who had shown the way. His legend grew as the Reconquista progressed. By the time Granada fell, he had become a national symbol. The Spain that emerged from the Reconquista was shaped by the centuries of struggle. The warrior culture that had produced Rodrigo Díaz became embedded in Spanish identity. The religious fervour that had motivated the Reconquista found new outlets in the conquest of the Americas and the wars of the Counter-Reformation. The treatment of religious minorities also reflected the Reconquista legacy. Muslims and Jews who remained in Christian territory faced increasing pressure to convert. The Inquisition, established in 1478, enforced religious conformity. The expulsion of the Jews in 1492 and the forced conversion of the remaining Muslims in the early 16th century completed the process. The religious diversity that had characterized medieval Iberia was eliminated. This outcome would have been foreign to Rodrigo Díaz. He had lived and worked among Muslims. He had commanded Muslim soldiers. He had ruled a city with a large Muslim population. He had not sought to convert or expel them. The Spain of the 16th century was very different from the Iberia of the 11th, but the legend of El Cid was adapted to fit the new circumstances. The complex historical figure was simplified into a crusading hero. His service to Muslim rulers was downplayed or forgotten. His pragmatic tolerance was ignored. He became what later generations needed him to be. This process of adaptation is not unique to El Cid. All legendary figures undergo similar transformations. Each generation reinterprets the past in light of its own concerns and values. The legend changes even as the historical reality remains fixed. The physical traces of Rodrigo's world have largely vanished. Valencia was rebuilt by the Almoravids and subsequent rulers. Little remains from the period of Christian rule under El Cid. The fortifications he built, The palace he inhabited, the cathedral he established, all are gone. The monastery of San Pedro de Cardeña still stands. Rodrigo's tomb is there, though it has been moved and modified over the centuries. Visitors can pay their respects to the legendary warrior. The monks who once promoted his cult are long gone, but the memory persists. In Burgos, the capital of Old Castile, a statue of El Cid dominates a bridge over the Arlanzon River. The bronze figure shows a mounted warrior, sword raised, charging into battle. It is an idealized image, more legend than history, but it captures something true about the man it commemorates. Rodrigo Díaz was above all a warrior. He lived by the sword. His fame rests on his martial achievements. The village of Vivar, where Rodrigo was born, still exists. It is a quiet place, little changed from its medieval origins. A monument marks the birthplace of El Cid. Tourists occasionally visit, but most of the time, Vivar drowses in the Castilian sun, keeping its secrets. We have traced the life of Rodrigo Díaz from his birth in Vivar to his death in Valencia. We have followed his career through service and exile, triumph and tragedy. We have watched the legend grow from the man. Now let us step back and try to understand what it all means. Who was El Cid? The question seems simple, but the answer is not. He was many things to many people. To his followers, he was a leader worthy of absolute loyalty. To his enemies, he was a formidable adversary. To the monks of Cardeña, he was a pious benefactor. To the poets who sang his praises, he was the perfect knight. To modern historians, he was a complex figure whose career illuminates the dynamics of medieval Iberia. Perhaps the most striking thing about Rodrigo is his ability to operate across boundaries. He served Christian kings and Muslim emirs. He commanded armies that included men of both faiths. He ruled a city with a diverse population. He moved between worlds that later generations would see as irreconcilably opposed. This flexibility was not unique to Rodrigo. It was characteristic of his time and place. 11th century Iberia was a frontier society, where identities were fluid and alliances were pragmatic. Religious difference mattered, but it was not the only thing that mattered. Survival, profit, and power also shaped behaviour. Rodrigo was a product of this world. He did not transcend it or transform it. He operated within its rules more successfully than most. His genius was practical, not visionary. He saw opportunities and seized them. He assessed risks and managed them. He built a career through skill, determination, and a certain ruthlessness. The ruthlessness should not be overlooked. Rodrigo could be harsh when he judged it necessary. The execution of Ibn Jahaf, burned alive after the fall of Valencia, reminds us that medieval warfare was brutal. Rodrigo was no gentle soul. He was a man of violence, living in a violent age, but he was also capable of restraint and even generosity. His treatment of defeated enemies was often merciful. His governance of Valencia was relatively tolerant. He inspired loyalty through fairness as well as force. The picture is complex, as pictures of real people usually are. What drove Rodrigo? Ambition, certainly. He sought wealth, power, and fame. He achieved all three. But there may have been more to it. The sources hint at a fierce pride, a determination to prove his worth against all challenges. The young knight from Vivar would not be overlooked or dismissed. He would make the world acknowledge him. The exiles were crucial in shaping this drive. To be cast out by Alfonso twice was a profound humiliation. Rodrigo responded by building something greater than anything Alfonso could have given him. Valencia was his answer to exile. It was proof that he needed no king's favour to achieve greatness. The relationship with Alfonso remains one of the most intriguing aspects of Rodrigo's career. King and warrior needed each other, but could not trust each other. Alfonso could not forgive Rodrigo's service to Sancho. Rodrigo could not forgive Alfonso's treatment of him. They circled each other warily, sometimes cooperating, sometimes conflicting, never reconciling. This troubled relationship reflects larger tensions in medieval society. The bonds between lords and vassals were supposed to be reciprocal. Lords owed protection and reward. Vassals owed loyalty and service. When these bonds frayed, the whole social fabric was threatened. Rodrigo's career can be read as a meditation on loyalty and its limits. He was intensely loyal to Sancho, and that loyalty cost him Alfonso's trust. He was loyal to his followers, and they reciprocated. But his loyalty to Alfonso was conditional, and it broke under the strain of repeated injustice. The legend simplified this complexity. The Cantar de Mio Cid depicts Rodrigo as a model vassal, loyal even when wronged. This was the lesson medieval society wanted to teach. Vassals should obey their lords, even unjust lords. The social order must be maintained. But the historical Rodrigo was more interesting than the legendary one. He did not simply accept his fate. He fought back. He built his own power. He defied the king who had wronged him. This defiance makes him a more compelling figure, even if it made him a less comfortable example. The military achievements remain impressive by any standard. Rodrigo never lost a major battle. He defeated the most powerful armies of his time. He conquered and held a major city against determined opposition. Few commanders in medieval Europe could match this record. His methods repay study. The combination of tactical skill, strategic vision, and inspirational leadership created a formidable package. Rodrigo understood war in all its dimensions. He was not just a brave fighter, though he was certainly that. He was a thinking commander who planned carefully and adapted flexibly. The legacy of El Cid extends beyond Spain. He has become a figure of world literature thanks to the Cantar de Mio Cid and its many adaptations. He represents certain universal themes: the hero unjustly exiled, the warrior who proves his worth against all odds, the leader who inspires absolute loyalty. These themes resonate across cultures and centuries. The 1961 film El Cid, starring Charlton Heston, brought the legend to a global audience. The film took considerable liberties with history, as films do, but it captured something of the epic sweep of the story. It showed why El Cid continues to fascinate. More recent scholarship has tried to recover the historical Rodrigo from beneath the layers of legend. This work has given us a more nuanced understanding of the man and his world. We can now see him in context, as a product of his time, rather than a timeless hero. But the legend persists alongside the history. Both are valuable. The history tells us what actually happened. The legend tells us what people wanted to believe happened. Together, they illuminate both the past and the human need to make meaning from it.